We're going to talk about business cycles. The material related to this topic, you can find it in Schiller, 8th edition, chapter 10. If you remember earlier, we had talked about two good economy, and in that case, we had, well, let's say, investment goods and consumer goods. Investment goods are roads and bridges and infrastructure and broadband technology, etc. R&D laboratories, universities, and so forth. Those are where the investment comes in. And consumer goods are food, clothing, housing, automobile, entertainment, and so forth. And in that context, we had, let's say, consumer goods, and we had investment goods. And we said that if we sink in all the resources the country has labor, land, raw material, etc., you can produce maybe maximum of this amount of consumer investment goods and zero on the consumer side. Or if you can take all of it and sink it in the production of consumer goods, then that's how much maximum consumer goods we can produce and zero on in terms of investment goods, or a combination. And that combination gave us this production possibility production possibility frontier curve, which shows that in the long run, when all the resources are applied, nothing is left out there untouched, then the society or country has this kind of a potential output and so forth. And then we talked about how, for a host of reasons, a country or a society may be at a point of producing both consumer goods and investment goods that is somewhere less than or inside the production possibility frontier, which means that some resources, unemployment of labor or material and land is there, and therefore is producing below its potential to produce. And so it would be a different combination. And the idea is that you eventually want to push the economy to go toward its productive capacity. And so whenever you move away from this potential toward inside this model, then it means that the economy is contracting, resources are being left idle, unemployment is on the rise. And then when you move back toward the production possibility frontier, it means that we are applying the resources fully and therefore the economy is expanding. Will you, in the short run, hit and go beyond? No, because this will put the upper limit as to how much an economy can produce. However, in the long run, you can grow this possibility, production possibility. And that's the idea of economic growth, so therefore you'll be striving to hit. But let's say within a year or two, this doesn't necessarily grow significantly. So your hope is to just land somewhere on or close to the production possibility frontier. You don't want to be 100% full employment because that has its own issues, which we will discuss along the way. So moving back and forth toward the production possibility frontier and inside as the unemployment sets in and so forth, it creates what we call business cycles. So if you were thinking in terms of, let's say, the long-term trends, you have here time, usually in years, and then you have real gross domestic product. And we'll discuss this real versus nominal gross domestic product shortly. So you have some kind of a long-term trend. And then as you move back and forth close to the production possibility frontier and back to the interior part of this model, you are going to see fluctuations. when you are above the trend, it means that you're really getting close, very close to the production possible frontier, which means along this stretch. When you're moving back inward, then you are along this stretch and back and forth and back and forth. So this is inherent to any economy, and it's not necessarily pleasant to see large number of people losing their jobs and getting it back again and so forth, but it's more or less inevitable. However, we do want to minimize these fluctuations. We don't want to go into a big, what we call recession, and have a very prolonged and deep, and then slowly move back up. That's not what we want. We want maybe milder fluctuations if possible. So we have to come up with economic policies that will promote or encourage a milder fluctuation in economic cycles. And so, in fact, figure 10.2 gives you real numbers that the real data that shows the actual economic fluctuations. And if you can see in the Great Depression period, 1929, 1933, the fluctuation was enormous. Then also during the war, as the economy peaked with production of war material and then collapsed shortly after. And then since 1950s onward, we have had sort of much smaller fluctuations in economic activities until 2008, where we are now seeing a dramatic increase in the economic fluctuation for the negative and so forth and so on. Let me just briefly touch on the idea of real gross domestic product versus nominal or money gross domestic product. Money or nominal gross domestic product is essentially you taking price of all goods, in let's say shoes, times the number of shoes produced, and that will give you some number. And then you have tires, price of tires times number of tires produced, and that gives you another number, and you go on and so forth. At the end, you add up all these dollar values and you get money or nominal gross domestic product. However, there are problems associated with this value. I apologize for the cell phone. That's sometimes should have been prevented. But in any case, now here, we measure the dollar value of all the final goods and services produced, final goods and services. Okay? And however, next year we may look at same number of shoes and the same number of tires and same number of watches, except that the prices have gone up, let's say by 10%. So at the end, this number will be larger, and yet represents the same amount of goods. And therefore, really is all inflation, not real amount of tires and shoes and watches and so forth and cars that people have had access to. So in order to come up with a better reflective of the performance of the economy, we take nominal GDP and deflate it for inflation, meaning that we take that 10% price hike out of it, and then what we end up with is real gross domestic product. And our concern is mostly the real output, not the money or nominal output, because we are really interested in sizing up the real performance of the economy. And so now let's, in that context, talk about the question of labor force, unemployment rate, and tie all of that to the business cycles, because really, when we are concerned about economic fluctuations associated with these downturns are unemployment of labor, and that's really unpleasant. Associated with these upturns is reduction in unemployment and often increase in wage inflation. And then of course wage inflation sooner or later finds its way into prices of goods and services that firms produce, which so therefore will experience price inflation. And by the same token, if we are experiencing economic downturns, sooner or later workers will be released, then maybe with sometimes a long delay, at least in the industrialized world, with unemployment benefits and so forth, wage deflation will eventually set in as workers accept lower wages, and therefore it is possible, not always, that we eventually experience price deflation. So these are kind of concepts that often are related to the business cycles in the economy. This was time in years often, and this is real output, GDP. So essentially you have population, percentage of these people are in the labor market because of of course, they met the minimum age requirement for employment and so forth, and they have some skills. So fraction of this makes up the labor force. For example, in the US, population is 310 million, of which around 150 to 160 million are in the labor force. These are people who are not in prison, they're not minors, they can hold on to a job, etc. They're not mentally deficient and so forth. And so therefore, they're not students and so forth. These are make up the labor force. Now, the unemployment is basically people who are unemployed, number of unemployed divided by the size of labor force. Okay? So if, for example, we happen to have, let's say, 14 million unemployed, and the labor force happens to be 154 million. So unemployment is 9.3% in the economy. And so essentially, now there are all kinds of discussions about who's considered unemployed and so forth, but nonetheless, this number, as it rises, we are going to translate that into economic decline relative to trend. And as the unemployment drops, uh, then we will begin to see economic recovery and expansion. However, historically, for the U.S. economy, somewhere between 4.5% to 5% in recent years has been associated with what we call full employment, meaning that anybody who wants a job more or less can find one. So if we deviate from this percentage of unemployment toward numbers that we are experiencing in recent past couple of years, then we are in this phase. And then when it comes back toward 4.5%, 5%, then we are experiencing the recovery. So again, you will understand these relationships more as we continue the conversation. And we talked about inflation earlier. There are all sorts of problems associated with inflation, meaning that higher prices of goods and services will chew up your wages, higher prices of goods and services will chew up in a real rate of return on your investment. So if you ever lend someone some money and by the time you get it back, inflation has gone up 5%. Whatever you get back, there's already been chewed up uh, with the higher prices, meaning that the purchasing power has declined. So for those reasons, there are all sorts of implications associated with rising prices. And so that doesn't mean we want falling prices. So for a number of reasons, if prices are falling, then the borrowers will suffer because when you borrow a certain amount and by the time you pay back, those dollars are actually stronger in terms of they can purchase more, so that the borrowers will refrain from accepting loans because they have to pay back with stronger dollars, and so for that reason, we will cause problems associated with deflation. So we don't want falling prices. Firms will refuse to invest if they feel that the price of what they're selling is going to be lower than before. So all of that is something that you want to avoid. But nonetheless, rapid inflation is undesirable. Falling prices is undesirable. Some minor inflation is not bad, is tolerated, and so therefore, historically, we have been focusing around 2 to 3% inflation as an acceptable arrangement, and we'll talk about these issues along the way. And so, again, the whole idea of business cycle is economic fluctuations, and you can think of it in terms of this model, years and output. You can think of it in terms of moving in and out of this production possibility frontier, meaning inward and back toward the production possibility frontier, which is tied to these fluctuations. And so with that, we will conclude our discussions here.